a good friend and a great professor, Professor Nils Napp from Cornell is here today. So Nils is coming from Cornell ACE, where he has been working there for a few years now, since 2020. And before that, he was a professor at University of Buffalo. He received his PhD from University of Washington, and then he did his postdoctoral degree at Harvard University's Wyss Institute. His research focuses on, I will read it because it's a long sentence, focuses on algorithms at the intersection of collaborative behavior and physical embodiment, and also asking the fundamental research question in the theory of emergent swarm behaviors. We will learn more about these from you today, Nils.
Absolutely,
thank you very much for coming. Let's welcome our
Thank you for the introduction.
speaker.
Thank you for being here. So the title of the talk is a little bit weird. So the first slide, I'm going to explain what the title of the talk is about and why I chose it. So this is a standard textbook on algorithm design by two Cornell professors. But when I picked this title, I actually was unaware that they were both Cornell professors. And in algorithm design, right, you have these, you try to figure out like how different ways of manipulating the memory and the computer scale. You look at like time complexity, space complexity. And when you design algorithms, what you're really wondering is like there is an internal state in the computer, like the memory, zeros and ones, and whatever your chunk of memory is, this program will transform it. And you want to figure out efficient ways of transforming this internal state somehow. And that is like what algorithm design is all about. And I find this picture super fascinating on this type, right? So this is a picture of two weaver birds. I don't know the exact species, but there are many species of weaver birds. And they're called weaver birds because they take twigs and grasses and then build a nest, sometimes alone, sometimes like one of them does it, sometimes they do it together. And then that's where they live and raise their young. And I asked one of the authors like why they chose this particular photo. And they said like, oh, you know, it's because like these birds are following this algorithm, like they're weaving over under, and then they build this nest. As a sort of bio-inspiration person, I find this an awesome example. As a roboticist, like thinking about like what the algorithm would be is actually really hard because it turns out when weaver birds first, like the first season, they're ready to mate, and they build nests. The really young ones, they build a nest and like half the time it falls down. Second year, it's like their success rate is a little bit higher, and after a few years, they're actually good at building nests. So there's a lot of really subtle behavior in actually building these nests. And if I'm a roboticist and I have all the tools of like Gazebo and JBullet and whatever other modeling frameworks I have, and I had to decide what the state is of this nest that's being manipulated by this algorithm, I would have a really hard time to actually concisely write that down. Because these grasses, they have directional friction, they have little hairs, and obviously that is really important for actually holding these things together. When you bend one of these grasses, they're hollow, and once you bend it, it's like a little joint in there where it's pre-kinked, and you have these stiff pieces of grass or little sticks in between, right? And it's totally unclear if this is important to model. And once I try to decide if I model them all, it'll become super intractable for me to actually reason about the success or not success of a particular weaving algorithm, right? So the reason I chose this title then is like, if I think of a robot as an embodied algorithm, where there's a state of the world before a robot runs a robot program, a state of the world after the robot runs its robot program. Ideally, right, like we would have this robot and transforming the world, this sort of this embodied agent would just kind of transform the world in a really predictable way. And what I'm really interested in, and kind of like one of the common themes about the different projects in my lab, is trying to figure out sort of what the level of detail is that you need to model. So you can do sort of top level algorithm design where you have proofs and to predict the behavior, and use that sort of as an abstract reasoning mechanism in such a way that it still allows you to then actually build the robots that execute that algorithm. And then there are two motivations for thinking about sort of the transformation of the external world with robots. Right? One is this sort of need application where construction automation is one of the sort of big growth areas in robotics. And the reason is that like the world is changing, we need more houses, more people are moving to cities. A lot of sort of developing countries are really quickly running out of housing stock. We are running out of housing stock in the US. And I think the last point is also kind of important that like if you read the news, right, there are all these natural disasters. The infrastructure that we build over hundreds of years is maybe not adequate for like what the weather and climate will be like tomorrow. So we need sort of efficiency in manipulating our built environment. And robots are a way of providing efficiency. So manipulating sort of the external world is a really good application. And then the other motivation for why this is interesting to look at from a sort of scientific view is if you look at different animals, so this is a log-log plot of the number of individuals in an animal colony, and this is the linear scale in terms of size, so also log-log plot. And this is like sort of different examples. These are different examples of different species of animals building large complex structures, right? So it goes from like individual ovenbirds that make little nests out of clay, there are like one or two of them. Beavers, they have like sort of these family groups that are normally in the like up to 10. They build really large dams, and like, you know, a beaver can really transform the ecology of a whole region. Right? Like once the water is dammed up, there's a marsh, it kills the trees, then I have a big pond. Like it really changes the like big areas of their environment.
Ask a question about that plot.
Oh yes, please do.
Is there something we conclude from this plot? Like I was hoping to see a linear line, something, but I don't see what pattern is on.
I don't know, except for like a correlation with larger colony size, larger. But I think it would be interesting what to conclude. So I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the talk at a time about like deconstruction, and we did look at terminates and something, but I don't know if there's any sort of insight that I at least spot, but you do exist. So if we can find out, so animals do it, and they do it in a way that's really different from how we manipulate the like sort of how we build things with automation, right? Like each agent in, let's say, like a bee colony or a termite colony, they don't have global knowledge of the state. They don't have a blueprint, and yet somehow they're able to build functional structures that like in a linear scale are 1,000 times bigger than an individual. So as a like volume scale, right? It's like to the third, so it'd be like 1 billion times bigger than the individual thing. And these things are like super complex, and they work, and they can adapt to the environment. So if we can figure out how to do this with robots, we can send lots of robots into the environment and manipulate it in ways that is good for us. So this is kind of, I'm going to go back to this when I hop around the different topics. So I'm going to talk about on the left of this are sort of what visual representations of what the extraction barriers are. In the middle is an example of the extraction material. On the right are some biological things that build in that way. So what I mean to indicate with that top left plot is that the way the world is represented is as an occupancy grid. The building element is either there or it is not there, like a 0 or 1 in a digital representation. And that's what I'm going to think about when I think about that's the state of the environment, right? And I want to figure out how agents can kind of manipulate the state to build certain structures. And then here, I want to think about the world as a much more complicated thing where there are continuous height functions that somehow represent an irregular environment, and I can fit building material into that. We're not going to talk about termites. It's some really early work that was inspired by that, but I have time in the end. We'll talk about bees. And they're kind of interesting because most things in the animal world are super messy. And bees are like one example where we actually have a lot of regularity. So we can use some of the tools of reasoning about like sort of regular structures in this particular example of animal construction. So talking about discrete rigid assembly, this is a little bit of a dated slide. But there are lots of examples of people building multiple robots trying to manipulate sort of building elements into large structures. And the sort of underlying assumption is normally that the agents actually know and share what their ultimate goal is. The thing that they don't know is what the current assembly state is, right? So I know I want to build a house out of 1,000 bricks. I know where the bricks should go. But as I'm executing this, I don't know which bricks have been placed and which ones have not been placed. Because I'm having these discrete rigid building elements, I have assembly order constraints. So normally, if I have like two rigid things on both sides, I can't slide in another rigid thing in between if I have connectors, right? And often I want these sort of self-aligning connectors in order to make good connections. So most of these systems sort of have this assembly order constraints that come from the fact that they're rigid and that I want to make good connections. And although the assembly order constraints kind of arise from these local sort of geometric constraints, I can have really long range consequences of that. For example, if I build a wall and I start with a brick here and here, 100 steps later, at some point, they will run into each other and I can't assemble this brick here. I don't know exactly where this will be, but this local thing, this local constraint kind of propagates to the system, and that is due to the sort of discrete nature. So one of the things that we do in my group is this is a picture of the Termi system, which is sort of one of the example systems that people often use. So there's this robot. It has these sort of legs that are co-designed with the bricks that it climbs on, and then it makes these sort of stacked tower structures. And what's shown sort of as a final structure, and also the video maybe played once of this sort of assembly order being computed, is that the little arrows mean that to the robot, it needs to check that both of the parents are there before it can build the child node in the sort of directed graph. And this encodes a whole bunch of different assembly orders you can make. And the arrows are such that a robot only needs to look at its immediate neighbors to check whether or not it's legal to make an assembly. So the robots can take this and kind of traverse the structure and then quickly decide using only local sensing whether or not it's legal to have a move and traverse the state space where there are these long range dependencies without ever running into deadlock. So over the years, we've come up with like sort of better and better ways of synthesizing these rule sets or for larger and larger structures. So now we can do like many thousands of things, really quickly synthesize these rules, and then also generalize this to other rigid systems where I'm trying to put rigid things together, right? Like once I know how to check whether or not this is a legal move, I can sort of quickly come up with these partial order constraints. So this isn't an ideal world. Another thing that we then looked at is sort of errors in execution, right? Like I have these like predictable things, like I can think of it as a 0-1 occupancy grid, and I want to like add a 1 somewhere when I assemble something. But every once in a while, a robot is supposed to put a brick there, and it's like putting it in the wrong location, or it thinks it's going forward and like missing a geometry and missing its track. So it doesn't really know where it is on the plan. So on the left is a plot of like sort of the number of assembly actions that the robots have taken. On the y-axis is the rate of completion. And for any sort of reasonable size structure, like once I get into the hundreds of parts that I need to put together, even super small error rates actually normally mean that the structure will not complete. So depending on what the error is that the robot makes, if it gets into like assemble something in the wrong order that's outside of this partial order, then the robots are stuck, can't actually ever make progress again. So because we're able to really quickly sort of synthesize these plans, we can now actually synthesize a whole bunch of plans and see whether or not a particular assemble plan is sensitive to particular errors. Right, and by error, I mean like a robot kind of like moving to the left and thinking it moved to the left and not moving to the left. Right? You can kind of see this particular assemble plan is actually better for this local execution with a robot that has a certain error. And the other thing that we more recently been doing, we just submitted this, so this is a team of like really capable master students in our group. Actually play. Where we tried to figure out if we can now instantiate this with a robotic system that uses sort of more or sort of less specialized materials. So this is insulation foam that we just cut on a foam cutter. We don't make like super contoured blocks. We kind of made the robot more complicated and the building material more simple. The robot like grabs a block, sort of traverses this grid, and then it has these sort of T-fastener staplers to staple this foam together. Right? So we can like take what we learned about the Termi system and now kind of play around with like, do we make the brick simpler to just use off-the-shelf materials and make the robot make the robot more complicated, and then also figure out sort of what the sensing ability is that we need for this new type of robot to execute these partial order. So these are kind of like fun lab systems, but these types of questions also show up in real world applications. So construction robotics is from Victor, New York, so upstate New York. This is a bricklaying robot, so it's a semi-automated Mason Sam. And sort of the approach that they use, right, is like an architect designs a sort of architecturally facade with bricks, different colored bricks. Then the planner figures out a total order of bricks. So there's a brick 1, brick 2, brick 3, and that's the order in which it needs to be assembled. But often in construction sites, actually, there are sort of disruptions to the flow that you expect. So if a crane moves overhead, then there can't be people underneath, so certain areas are blocked. But if this was a partial order plan, right, then the robot could instantly tell, oh, if this was assembled, I can have like an option of multiple other things that would be legal moves without having to be blocked by certain progressions in the state space, right? So the types of things that we originally think of or normally think of as like these distributed, like rules for distributed execution are also super beneficial if it's just a single robot, because baked into this pre-computed plan is a bunch of flexibility. And this is a plot that for a sort of small to medium sized systems where we can actually sort of combinatorially look at all the different ways in which stuff is taken apart. So what I'm really interested in, like sort of in this stream of work, is that if there's no gravity and no assembly order constraints, right, and I had n different bricks, then I would have 2 to the n states I could reach. It's 0 to 1. But that's not really reality. If I only have the assembly order constraints and gravity, but not execute one of these partial plans. So I'm looking at all the different things in which stuff could be assembled. I don't know if you're familiar with assembly planning, sort of the and/or graph way of representing assembly, which is complete. Then I get this dashed line. So these are all the things that are physically possible for the material, without the restriction that they're being put together by robots that have only local information. The solid line is the partial order plan executed by distributed assembly. And then this red line is the linear plan, right? Where there's no flexibility built in. There's only sort of, if there are n pieces, then I can reach n to the n plus 1 states, like nothing, then all the partial assemblies. So what's interesting here is like we can kind of think about like the number of states I can reach and like what fraction of that is kind of restricted from us because of physics. What part of that is restricted to us because we're just trying to use local distributed assembly without having global knowledge, right? And it's the gap between these two graphs. And from a design perspective, that's great, right? Because we designed this particular material, this particular robot to assemble things in a distributed way. And we're not really losing much beyond like what the material is capable of because we're treating it in a distributed. So we can kind of have this like design trade-off in this space where before we go run off and tell some master students to design a new robot system, which takes a long time, we can think about like sort of the motion capability of a robot with respect to the building material. So in this Termi system, right, these are heavily co-optimized. Like there are little bridges here with these little wheel robots that go in here that align it so that they can use sort of minimal sensing to climb on this, and it can still reliably build sort of small, medium-sized structures, right? Because these Termi's robots also have an error. And so this is super tightly co-designed, and the local plans that only depend on their immediate neighbors. If I had a longer range sensor, right, I can have more transitions in here because I can kind of check if other states are true. I'm not restricted to only checking whether or not my immediate neighbors are assembled. So I can kind of think about the system, right? And I can have like the robot material co-design with the planning and sensing. And I can make these decisions before I run off and build one of these robots. Before I move on, I think sort of this view of the world where I have discrete things, right? Like I showed you lab robots with lab building materials. But a lot of the way in which construction now goes is they're trying to do automation where you have prefabricated components that I want to put together into a house. So instead of an individual brick, I put together like a whole facade or a window, and then I kind of snap those together on the construction site to build larger structures, right? But that looks like exactly this kind of system, except for now the individual building components aren't all uniform, they're kind of specialized, right? But I still have assembly order constraints that I'm expressing whether or not the structure is done as this occupancy grid. So one of the things that I think is super amazing about biological construction is that it kind of builds into the environment, right? If I look at a termite mound or one of these nests or an anthill, right? It's like fits into the environment. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is like some level of abstraction where we're trying to capture that aspect of animal construction and still allow sort of local sensing in order to achieve goals. Particular application for this would be like, we want robots to do dangerous, dull, and dirty things. Working in a disaster site is maybe not dull, but it's certainly dangerous and dirty. And if I want to move around in this sort of rubbly environment, it's maybe also pretty tedious, right? I need to sort through all these stuff. So I want to come up with some sort of abstraction barrier that allows me to reason in a formal way about operating these types of environments. So the particular example that we have for that is we formulated what we call the ramp building problem, where I have a goal location that's indicated by the red flag. I have robots moving around in this space. They have local sensing. So these red lines, dashed lines are supposed to indicate like the amount of like geometric information that a robot can gather. And I want robots to manipulate this environment and like sort of build stuff. So this is this additive yellow goop in there. So that after a certain number of iterations, I guarantee that the robots will like be able to navigate from any location into the goal. Right? So that's the ramp building. Now, if we want to do that, right, to sort of and generate a proof for that, we need to like decide three things. The first is I need to think about modeling the structure. In order to capture this irregularity, we're going to use continuous height functions, R. So the height function and then h naught, because it's the first one. So that's our initial type. Then we have like a finite building area. So it's a positive real valued function on some finite area that represents the state of the world. And then the robots move around on this. They add material. So the robot has a position X, it can add material. And then after that, it turns into the next height function H1. So it's a continuous space, discrete time process that we're thinking about. So that's what that's gonna be the state. So then the property that we want to achieve, we want for a ramp building, we want all the points between this, like where the robot starts and where it goes to be navigable. And we want to express navigability as like sort of a property of a height function. So what we, like one way in which we came up with formalizing this is we want these height functions to be almost Lipschitz continuous. So Lipschitz continuity is for the function, I take the value at 2 points in the domain, look at the function value. And if I draw a straight line between those points, that slope needs to be bounded by k. One of the definitions for being Lipschitz. There are alternative ones, but in real value functions, that's what we should think about. Now, we want to somehow use this as an abstraction barrier for real robots. So if I have a little square pebble and a giant robot wheel, then obviously the robot should be able to drive over this tiny wheel. So we want to be able to also accommodate small discontinuities, because otherwise this property of being strictly Lipschitz is way too restricted and it doesn't really represent what the robot can do. Then we have this local property that's kind of like the body length of a robot, right? So we can only have one of these discontinuities per body length, because otherwise we can make steep stuff by just adding a bunch of small discontinuities. So this is the property we want to achieve. And the way to think about this is like, you give me a robot and I will compute for you these three parameters r, k, and epsilon. And if the height function, if the world is navigable with respect to these parameters, then I'm guaranteed that I'm able to drive over it. So it's a sufficient condition. It's not sort of maximum what the robot can necessarily navigate. What we're really interested in is generating guarantees in this space, right? So a sufficient condition is fine. So then the last thing is what these modifications look like. So this started out as like robots squirting polyurethane foam into the world. So we call these amorphous depositions because the robot kind of decides the top sometimes of what it's building, but the bottom is like totally determined by the environment. And one way of doing that is that the robot gets to decide these two parameters for a cone, upside down cone, so the location and height. This is the robot's choice on building something. And then we have a deposition operator that's basically like the max of the function that the robot chose and the terrain. Right? And that then becomes my new HN plus. So now I've taken this problem of like building in a cluttered, irregular environment and turned it into this really concrete question where I can say, what happens if I repeatedly apply this operator on the world? Does that ever stop? And is the function navigable with respect to our function once it stops? So here's a simplified simulation. Should be starting.
The obvious rude question to ask.
Oh, please.
So this is a cool idea, but what happens when two dimensions?
Oh.
So the Lipschitz is like a matrix. I don't know if the outlet is.
Yeah, so it still works. I'll talk about that in a couple slides.
Okay.
So this is the simulation, 1D, right? So the blue thing is the location of the robot. The dotted line is the sensing range. And then these depositions are these upside down cones that the robot chooses, right? So this is a pretty high level simulation. It removes a lot of detail. But you can see here that the cones are actually not perfect cones. The cones are kind of have some additive noise or subtractive noise to what the robot chooses, and this still works. The reason this works is that if I knew my terrain perfectly, I can compute a global upper bound that is never going to be violated with a certain deposition strategy. Every deposition is going to be strictly positive. At some point, this has to stop because the thing is growing by a non-negative, a strictly positive amount. It's bounded above, it's going to stop. And based on the decision strategy, this then implies that there are no non-navigable points of the robot. We then generalize this a little bit where instead of choosing these bounds, there's sort of this nice partial order or this order of like, if I evaluated what this upper bound is on restricted subsets of the domain, I can compute this Lipschitz bound. And basically, anything I put under this upper bound will be fine. I still get the same guarantees. I don't need to just have upside down cones. And it's maximal in the sense that this is like as much as I can possibly put down without potentially actually causing a problem. So again, we have this like pretty high level view of the world. And we can now start making some design decisions, right? I can think about the motion capability of a robot with these Ks and epsilons. This implies some restrictions on the building material because if my building material is so big that it's bigger than an epsilon, it's not possible often to actually build something that is Lipschitz that is navigable by this definition because it would make, like each deposition would make these discontinuities that are bigger than the wheel. And it also has some restriction on the sensing where if I have a better sensor over a larger range, I can put in more things. Your 2D question. In the 1D world, separating the space of the world that's navigable and non-navigable is very easy because I just pick a separation point and assume everything behind me is navigable. In 2D, this is a little bit harder. So here, this is a picture of some like simulated rubble environment. The blue stuff is navigable. The yellow stuff is not yet navigable. So I can embed this sort of 1D algorithm in this 2D world by the robot trying to make progress to the goal, which is the start, right? Then it chooses, like in the simplest form, like let's say it just tried to go there straight. At some point I will run, either I make it, done, or I run into a non-navigable point. And then I use that non-navigable point as like, that's where I'm gonna modify the environment. modify the environment with an additive deposition by the same 1D algorithm. Then I go back, fetch more building material, and do the same. So if you keep doing that, which I'll start automatically. So this is a sped up experiment of a robot grabbing bags. And the robot just follows the same rule, right? It like grabs a bag. The bags are smaller than like the epsilon deposition code that we computed for the navigability of that particular platform. And the robot just keeps doing that. And it's sort of reactive in the sense that like every time, like it just rescan, like it's a new scan of the environment, then it decides where the next deposition should be. It makes it, and then it just continuously tries to achieve navigability towards the goal. And if a student came in and just like kicked this all around and broke the ramp that's partially built, the robot would just keep doing this, right? Until it succeeds or runs out of bags or runs out of that.
It seems like you plant something in one dimension, you try to execute that, and then as you're executing, if there's wobble, then you go back to more materials to make.
Yeah, so it's more than wobble. We actually have like a voxelized version of the world. That's what we base.
I mean, I'm sorry, I mean,
non-navigable. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But it's like you're building a ramp up a hill.
Yeah, yes, it can go downhill too. You just drop it where you are. Right. Exactly. So because this is like pretty permissive in what how we're able to modify the environment, right? We can also choose a whole bunch of different materials. So this is a construction scenario where one robot has a like sort of suction gripper that it can use to manipulate foam blocks. Another robot can pick up different sizes of bags. And then the robots really try to like put out as much material with the assembly action as possible. And this really cuts down the number of trips that you need to make it, the number of modifications. And we can just use different materials and kind of still get the same guarantees because like what we need the robot to do is just like fit anything you can under this height function. This is a picture of the multi-material version. And then we then also tried to not have to bring our own building material and pick up sort of natural stones. So these are like rocks that we got from Lowe's or Home Depot, I forget which one, and they're just like gardening rocks. So the building material here is to like sort of actual rocks put into another rocky environment in order to make the world. And so obviously just rearranging the material instead of like bringing your own construction material would really be useful in like remote environments. So for example, if I wanted to build sort of anti-erosion infrastructure over large areas, like this is kind of what you want to do. So this is the sort of adaptive ramp building. So we can use a whole bunch of different types of materials. And the reason we can do that like really reliably is that we think of like navigability as a like sort of affordance of the environment, and the robot continuously manipulates the environment in order to achieve more and more navigability. We also started looking at some of the sort of things that can go wrong. So one is right now we're assuming that the height function stays constant between sort of assembly actions. So we looked at sort of how the structure deforms as we use it. We also looked at sort of large collaborations, like in simulations, what happens if you have like, you know, dozens of these robots work over really large areas where maybe they don't share localization, right? So they kind of perceive the world differently. How that looks in terms of collaboration. And because all the robots are just reactive, like you can still pretty freely mix robots together as long as they fit this like sort of idealized abstraction. We also then started like building with found materials. We kind of went down this side rabbit hole, where these are a whole bunch of dry stacked structures from around the world. This is a coffee table book of like beautiful walls. And dry stacking means like I take rocks, I rearrange them, I put them on top of each other, and they're held together by friction and gravity. It's a really old construction technique. So we still have like Neolithic structures like built in the late Stone Age of just dry stacked rocks. They're around the world. So people have been doing this. It is kind of the ideal robot application in some ways because it's super tedious to do. So it's dull. It's dirty. And I don't know if it's super dangerous, but it could be dangerous. Right? But it's this kind of thing where a robot could potentially build structures, permanent structures, without consuming any actual building material, just rearranging things. So we looked more at the specific problem of dry stacking outside of the context of adaptive ramp building. So this is like what our general setup looks like, and we have like several versions of this. So there's a robot arm that has a wrist camera to register the rocks. The rocks are pre-scanned to pretty high resolution. And then there is a table, like sort of shaker table, like a little earthquake table that allows us to evaluate the structural stability of what we build. This is not a super easy problem, mostly because of the very rigid contacts and the ability to predict friction in rigid body simulations is pretty meh. So when you're trying to predict whether or not a particular structure will work, often that's not quite true. So these are different structures we built over the years. So we started with just evaluating sort of, if I wanted to do a simplified 2D version, what does like the structure look like if the building elements become more and more irregular? Because if I have a robot and like send it out into the world and said, build a wall, then what wall is being built really depends on the type of construction materials you find. And you probably want like sort of different plans and different planners for different distribution levels. Then this is, I don't know if this is super clear. This is the same plan wall executed multiple times on the shape table. So this is one plan where we're saying this rock should go here, this rock should go here. We executed it multiple times with the same robot and then evaluated the stability. And they're different. They're not super different, so they're pretty like like a strong wall. It's typically lasts longer on the shape. What was almost more interesting is that if we also then compared it to the simulated stability, right? Those are also only correlated. There are many instances of a thing. If you build it once and it looks really strong in simulation, you really want to simulate it multiple times to figure out whether or not a particular structure is strong. And if it is consistently strong in simulation, then it turns out to be something that is also much easier to build and better to build in reality. We got some statistics on sort of how correlated or particular physics simulator is to the reality we measure. And lots of groups, so there are not that many groups working on dry stacking, but there are some. A lot of them don't really do this repeated testing. And I think it's super important because if you just sort of build stuff in simulation, what you build in simulation might not actually be strong. And if you build it once, then it might not actually be a good solution. You have to kind of build it multiple times. Then we also built like a clochant, so it's like a rock igloo. And they're like, they're around the world, but there's like from like the British Isles. So that's their version. And then we also, I think this is actually the last picture, but it's the first thing we did to just evaluate the sort of how well we're able to stack rocks with robots. We just tried to like build a tower with as many rocks as possible. I think I have a little bit of time left. So let me talk about embodied algorithms for agents that are not robots. So we have this collaborator. So there's this famous bee biologist at Cornell. I think he retired last year, Tom Seelig, and one of his postdocs, we overlapped, and we started this collaboration of trying to figure out, like, how do agents manipulate their environment? What happens if we want to model what the bees do? So this is an actual biological construction thing. We wanted to figure out if we can help sort of understand biology. This is a a frame from a beehive from Michael. These are the beehive, these boxes. Inside each box, there are a bunch of these frames that are kind of hanging in there like a hanging folder. Inside, this is like completely pitch black, right? It's sealed in. And this is what the bees do. They build these structures. Often, if you make your own honey, often you actually fill in sort of partially built cells so that you know what the bees will build. We're interested in how the bees decide to solve building challenges. So we gave them this frame without a foundation that was kind of seeding the construction. So when the bees build, they start from the top and then kind of build these lobes down. And if you don't disturb this construction process, the bees would happily sort of just keep building perfectly regularly. But they cannot, because there are sort of two things going on that will prevent bees from making perfectly regular cells. This is, so the bees that kind of initiate this comb building in multiple sites normally. So I have a perfectly regular hexagonal coordinate system here. I have a perfectly regular hexagonal coordinate system here. But once they meet, the chances of those coordinate systems matching up perfectly is 0, right? So what looks like a regular cell in this coordinate system is not a regular cell in this one. Even if they're the same size, they're going to be offset, so they don't actually, they're no longer perfectly regular. When the bees, they actually want to fill out this whole comb, right? At that point, they run into this issue where they need to reconcile sort of conflicting things. And we're interested in predicting what their irregular cells are at that particular. The second reason that bees cannot build perfectly hexagonal cells is the biology of honeybees. So all the worker bees that collect pollen and make honey are female. The male bees are called drones. They're the reproductive part. All they really do is grow up, fly out, mate with a queen if they find one, and then die. They don't really do anything other than this. The drones are a little bit bigger, and if in the spring you ever see like a bee with freakishly large eyes, it's probably a drone from a different species, because the drones typically have like absurdly big eyes, like the whole head, because all they do is like look for queens to mate with. If you look at this long enough, it's a little hard to see when the first time you look at it, but all these cells on the bottom are actually bigger. They're bigger because that's where the colony decided to rear drones, because they started a reproductive. Again, I now have these like fault lines where somewhere here, right, like I can't really make things perfectly hexagonal all the way because these cells are bigger than that. So we're trying to figure out, like, can we come up with a description, like some abstraction that allows us to reason about how bees build this comb. So the actual construction process for bees is that when bees build this honeycomb, they actually have wax, and it comes out almost like earwax between the plates on the back. It comes out with like really thin wax plates. So you want to reason about the deposition of cells, like the shape of the final cells. But each cell is actually the result of like hundreds of building actions by an individual bee, right? We don't yet, like, I mean, ideally it'd be great to figure out like the local cues and building behavior of bees, but really right now we can kind of like abstract away the actual building process, construction process, because we know it's gonna end up in some sort of like regular polygon, or not really, some kind of polygon, mostly regular, and that's what we want to focus on. So we want to abstract this away. So what we did is, instead of keeping track of the whole thing, we represent each cell as its cell center. Then we get rid of the whole comb, all the walls. So these are just the cell centers from this comb. And then to figure out where the actual walls are, we then draw the Verona partition induced by those cell centers. Right? So when we reason about like what the bees are doing, we're just thinking of the cell centers to get rid of the walls, and it's a much easier representation. So one of the things of like working with a world-class bee biologist is that we have awesome data. So this is like, I think like from 10 separate colonies, 4 of these frames each, like 50,000 cells that we tracked. And these are the transitions from going from a worker side to a drone side. You can see how on the y-axis the cell size. At this transition, they kind of add some non-hexagonal cells. So it might be a little hard to see from the back. There's some 5-sided cells, there's some 7-sided cells. Every once in a while, there's an 8-sided cell as well. So this was kind of like just awesome data to get because it's really quantitative and how bees produce this transition between these different things. And then we came out with this like relatively simple model, right? We have these 2 coordinate systems on each side. The coordinate system predicts where the centers of the cells should be. Then we predict cell centers forward in both directions until they hit each other. We don't add those cells. But because we know what the average size should be, we know how many extra cell centers should be in this environment, we then place cell centers kind of as far away from the existing cell centers because they're already kind of crammed. And then we do some least squares optimization for the preferred cell center size. And this model does a really good job of predicting not necessarily the cell size at this transition, but if we look at the proportion of non-hexagonal cells that are produced, then it matches the biological data very well. So we're able to then say this kind of merge is actually harder for bees because there are more non-hexagonal cells in this particular configuration as opposed to like sort of a simpler merge where the different coordinate systems almost line. This was a PNS paper. We then used the biologist's connection to look at other species. We came up with this really nice representation. So these are 2 examples of, on the left is a bee, on the right is a wasp nest. So there are lots of species that have hexagonal nests. They build differently. So in these sort of wild nests, they're not enclosed. And the bees kind of start from the top, and then at some point say like our colony is healthy enough, we want to switch to reproductive mode, and then they need to add more big cells. And this is true both for the wasps and the bees. So instead of trying to merge sort of irreconcilable coordinate systems, we can look at transitions where, this is being built in a regular way, and now the bees get to decide how to place a slightly larger coordinate system on the wall. And the species that we had, I think we had like 9 species or something, and this includes both like paper nests, wasp nests, and the individual species were like separated by like over 100 million years of evolution. You can come up with a pretty simple relation where alpha is the difference between a sort of multiplicative factor of a drone-sized cell versus a worker-sized cell. And then we can figure out like what it would look like if the bees try to optimally sort of align where the cell centers are to produce as few irregular cells as possible. At some point, because I'm moving sideways, I'm adding more and more little bits of the larger cell, and I need to skip a connection from the bottom, top to bottom. And if these are the cell centers, then the connection in the Delaunay triangulation of this correspond to the number of sides of the Werner partition. And we can figure out that at some point the bees, even if they do this optimally, are just going to be forced to insert a 5-7-sided pair. And then we kind of compared this to these like widely different species and figured out that, so there are 2 things bees could do, right? So here's one strategy that you would use for sort of smaller dimorphism. I could sort of gradually transition without having to like keep all the cells hexagonal. Because if you transition, the sort of size difference would be not as fast. So I can build intermediate sized cells without actually introducing any non-hexagonal ones. Right, so all of these are hexagons. Here, this is the high dimorphism case. It's really probably better for these species to like quickly get it over with, make a 1-layer transition where I insert these 5-7-sided pairs, because with this high dimorphism case, the number of layers of intermediate cells would be super large. And they're like kind of, maybe I can use them as storage, as worker cells, but they're too small for drone cells. And really this species is trying to switch to the reproductive. So this matches like the biological data pretty well. It's a little hard to say like what exactly the bees are optimizing for. but certainly in the high dimorphism case, the model we come up with matches what we observe. It's super awesome to work, or super fun to work with biologists. I think there are also a lot of applications for irregular honeycomb. So if you look at sort of like high performance structures, often they're sandwiched honeycomb structures because they have the sort of minimal surfaces, so I can make stuff that's super light and super stiff. So they're like cardboard boxes. This is an acoustic panel. The inside of like all high performance hulls or rowboats or something is like, composite honeycomb. Aircraft wings is like, two shells separate by honeycomb. And sort of how stiff the thing is depends on sort of how densely it's filled with honeycomb, right? So from an engineering perspective, if you can easily manufacture it, right, there are situations where you might want a high load part of the wing interact with a lower part load of the wing. You want to change the internal cell size, right? And one of the things that you could do is maybe figure out sort of how to quickly compute these solutions. I'm not sure that this is the best way of doing it, but certainly if the bees do something really clever, then it might have engineering. So just to wrap things up, in general, like, the representation of the environment is super important, right? Like if you build these robotic systems that interact with the environment, you really want to think about the representation of that is like sort of as abstract as possible while still capturing the sort of specific things that we want to capture, because that allows you to then generate sort of theories and proofs in a way that just using a rigid body simulator would never allow you to. Sort of having these intermediate abstractions then allows you to have like this sort of mid layer of representation that you could use for generating algorithms. And then from the bottom, it gives you like a design for actually building the system and instantiate them with robots. And that's like what we did in the discrete case, what we did with the amorphous construction stuff. And then because we really thought about how to represent space, it also allowed us to help out some biologists. So I want to thank my group and current students, and I want to give a big shout out to Vivek Pengavalu, who is here. He's a postdoc at CMU, and a lot of the robots are actually his. So if you have questions on how it's done, you should ask Vivek. And my collaborators, Kirsten Peterson and Michael Smith, who is the bee expert, and then Scott McArt, who is a bumblebee expert. So we have some observational experiments for observing bumblebees, but not so much about the structure. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Nils. I think we have some time for questions.
Okay.
Oh, there, go.
Ramp building. What's on positing things to
One more time.
positing things to is there any looking to like make things down to get
So the question, just to repeat for everybody, was like the ramp building stuff was like purely additive. Do we think about removing stuff, right? Like if we're saying the reason that I can't move from A to B is an obstacle, maybe I just remove the obstacle instead of building the ramp. So we certainly thought about it. The thing is that the sort of proof structure of like this will only go up and there's an upper bound that is convergent, kind of implicit, like it relies, like this will terminate, relies on the fact that it's only going up. So if some robots go up and some robots go down, then they might do that indefinitely. If you're willing to share more information and don't have this purely reactive thing, then I think it's entirely feasible and probably a very good idea. We kind of focused on this like very bio-inspired, like robot sees world, robot does. Yeah.
Abstractions.
Yeah, sure.
Like hierarchies of abstractions where you have more detail.
Yeah, so the question is, have we thought about like hierarchies of abstraction? I think when you build a robot, you kind of do, already, right? Like because you build robots from systems, and the systems like they kind of have input-output behavior, and you don't care how it's built. So in that sense, I mean, we use it like everybody else. I think in this work, we really focused on like kind of formal, like sort of having more abstract representation of complicated processes, not so much necessarily nesting that to a higher level of abstraction. We did at some point think about in the rock stacking, instead of like just building a structure, maybe we can come up with these shapes like as a sort of abstraction, right? And then come up with plans for building these shapes, and then we compose those to build really large structures. So we treat a like giant rock wall as a composition of smaller rock wall building problems as opposed to one giant wall. But it turns out stacking rock walls is so hard that like focus on the small ones.
We're not building from robots to bigger
Mhm.
I think it's what
This is a great question. So the question was, does one robot's deposition affect the navigability constraints of another robot? So obviously it does, right? Because a deposition can easily make something that was navigable non-navigable, right? Like if it was like on the borderline and I put something there, something's. It kind of has to, because I need to propagate information through the environment. So like I need to be able to respond to it. I think Howie's question was really good about like what happens in 2D, because like path planning in 2D is a lot harder than path planning in 1D. Because path planning in 1D is not hard. And there is the potential for robots to trap each other, right? Like if I had two robots and kind of looked like this, right? And one robot drove in here, did whatever it wanted to do, another robot decided to close this off, then that would be a problem. Right now, we kind of restricted our path planners and our initial terrains for that not to be necessarily a problem. But there would probably need to be some coordination in how you partition like the non-navigable part and the navigable part in such a way that you don't trap robots. I think towards the end of his PhD, we did think about that, like, and it would require some sort of structuring of the travel direction. So if you also impose like the types of motion plans that a robot executes, then you can avoid it, right? But it requires sort of an additional layer of knowledge of, in addition to a robot just like seeing a thing and responding.
So how do you assume that in the ramp building case that the ramps can be stable because of what they want to put?
Another great question. Right, this abstraction does not cover that, right? It says it's a height function and it's like a driving. So it's like kind of, it's assuming it's stable. If the ramps that you're building, right, if the K for the navigability is really low, it's not necessarily a bad assumption, right? Depending on the building material. So do you know like the angle of repose, right? Like if I take a whole bunch of rocks and drop them randomly, there's sort of a certain angle of stability that depends on the irregular, like what exactly sort of statistics of the regular things go off the same, right? So if this was my K, this would not be good with the building material because like all these things are just on the edge of being unstable. If, right, this is my angle of repose and I build something that's really shallow, then this is probably going to be fine. Like I don't need to think about stability with this particular building material. We did run into this a little bit with like certain types of building materials. So for the foam blocks, they're really slippery. So if you build with only foam blocks, you kind of get this sliding around in a way that's like pretty bad for robots to move on. But if you're willing to just mix in other materials, you can kind of like do some engineering tricks so that this like sort of mid-level abstraction is still true, right? So I think it's subtle to do, right? But then it's you as a robot builder, it's like your job to make sure that the structure is stable. But I think there's more interesting theory to be had. Like maybe in addition to a height, I also have like some notion of utility or stability for different points, and I use that in decision making there.
abstraction stuff is almost, you're not specifying a structure, you're specifying a goal.
Yeah.
Generating a structure that achieves that goal.
Exactly.
Thought about that kind of thing in other settings?
I would love to. So I think a lot of the ways in which like artifacts of animal construction are so adaptable is because they do that, right? They don't really care of the exact shape of things. They care about like in a nest, right? Am I enclosed? I don't care if it's like perfectly circular or oval. Right? Like there's sort of this functionality, and they probably the animals have some way of measuring how close are they being to functional, and I kind of like move it closer and closer. We really restricted ourselves to like things that you can check locally, because we wanted to have like this idea that it can have lots of robots and just build them in the environment. So, and navigability is something that you can check locally, right? Like if there's some large world and I can check locally that's navigable everywhere, it's allowed, right? And I don't know that many other structures that are like that, right? For the stacking, stability is actually super hard, right? Like if there's a large rock wall and just move like one little thing on the bottom, globally, the whole thing becomes unstable. But if there are other structures where you can kind of check based on the things you can sense, then yeah, you can probably do other stuff. If you have more sophisticated sensor, then probably the types of things where you can have the functional feedback is strong. Yeah, memory. So memory is hard because if lots of, I mean, this is the thing with the Termites robots, right? Like if lots of robots are manipulating the world, then your memory is, what you remember seeing is not actually the state of the world, right? So it's more than just memory. If I have many agents, it has to do with like sharing the current state that you can sense or communicate over.
So your example of exposure.
Yeah. All right, I'm happy to answer more questions. I want to see two things. Cornell is hiring two positions, one in CPS, that's an MAE, one as, I'm not sure this is computer architect in ECE. No idea, go ahead and send them to me. And